I think really painting is very important, and that of course is the bias of an artist who works with paint. But I'm also fascinated by the story of paint, how it lives and dies. It's a bit like kind of an urban zombie. It seems like it's been killed off, but it keeps coming back. I also like artists who see the entire world through painting, and the guy who springs to mind first off is the Russian artist Malevich, who managed to develop an entire philosophy of life out of painting, and through him painting became also everything, as well as sculpture and architecture and a philosophy for a new Russia and a new century. And I think the question of abstraction grows out of that as well too. You know, what do you do with painting after everything's been done in painting? And the big question at the beginning of the 20th century was answered by abstraction. And I think, you know, those guys, Malevich and Mondrian, the first European avant-garde, really came up with incredible ideas in relationship to painting. And so we ask ourselves the same question in the 21st century: why painting? What's happening with painting? And I think now the interesting answer to that question can't be the same answer as it was 100 years ago, but the answer now is something like, I think, expanded painting. Yeah, expanded painting, it's a very loosely used term, but it has, I think, a specific and interesting history that begins with Picasso and Duchamp, once again with the European avant-garde. In particular, the way Picasso started to use real objects in his paintings, like putting ropes around the canvas or using clippings from wallpaper or newspapers or fabric from furniture. And then Duchamp riffed on that by using a bicycle wheel in his first, one of his first ready-mades. So painters started to do things that didn't look like painting, but they were still working in the world of what we'd call avant-garde painting. And then the idea of painting got changed again, I think very importantly in the 1960s with conceptual art, where Australian artists like Ian Byrne and many international conceptual artists were all painters. They all trained as painters and then tried to do the exact opposite of painting, get away from painting altogether, but whatever they did still held the flavour of painting about it, particularly if you look at the fantastic works of Ian Byrne. So expanded also is a really common term that's been used in lots of media, like expanded sculpture and expanded cinema. And I think it's just a tendency that comes from the media age, from the 60s onwards. Everybody starts to think about how one thing can be plugged into something else, how things can be multi-purpose, how things can do many things at the same time. The best example being a mobile phone, which is really not a phone at all. It's a handheld computer that just happens to be able to make phone calls. And so the same thing with painting. As it becomes expanded painting, it just happens to have the word painting, but it also does many other things that we might mistake for sculpture or installation art or performance or video. And in the 21st century, I think it's important for all media to be able to be aware of all other media, and the boundaries begin to break down so that it's hard to tell the difference between expanded sculpture, expanded painting, expanded photography, expanded cinema, expanded architecture, and so on. When I left school, I studied law, and in my final year of law, I remember watching a TV show late at night while I was studying, and it was Robert Hughes' Landscape with Figures, and it completely blew my mind, and art was a foreign thing to me then, but I fell immediately in love with it at that particular point. So I gradually moved away from thinking about law as a career and studied art. And when I went to art school, the two things I loved the most were painting and film, because really I'd grown up as a latchkey child watching TV every afternoon. TV was always the thing that changed my life in some way or another, particularly through Landscape with Figures, the Robert Hughes TV show, and many other things later on in my life. So I'd always wanted to do both those things, painting and film. I still make films and videos and interactives, and I found that with that double love and always following those two things, that there was never a boundary between the two of them. They always joined up in some way or another. So if there was no boundary between painting and film, there was also no boundary between painting and sculpture, or sculpture and performance and video and so on. So that kind of double love helped me to find a way to breaking down the barriers between any of the disciplines. But the question people often ask about that is, well, why even put the word painting in what you do? Why call it expanded painting? Why not just call it art? And I think it's a really good question, and the way I answer that is that much like the way conceptual artists dropped painting to find a form of practice that was no longer media specific, whatever they did because of their early training still had that fantastic aroma of painting about whatever they did. So I find that whatever I do in any of those other media, which I call a part of expanded painting, there is this lingering aroma of something around painting. And the most important thing, I think, is colour itself. And that used to be the original, traditional, historical definition of painting, that it was the medium to which colour was most logically attached. It was the discipline that all painters had to know. They had to know how to make colour. They had to know their colour theory and so on. So I find that as the traditional definition of painting breaks down, the idea of paint in a tube and a brush and a flat surface and a canvas and hanging it on the wall, as all of those elements are discarded, the one thing that remains is colour. So for me, when I make my work and I think of it as expanded painting, what's going on for me is something around colour. Where can colour go in the world we live in today if it doesn't have to be as paint in a tube? And the answer to that is that it can go everywhere. In fact, it is in everything. Everything that we use today is somehow embedded with colour, and that's mostly because of plastic. And the biggest revolution that took place in colour technology in the 20th century was acrylic paint, which is a way of getting coloured pigment into an acrylic medium, which took away from the dominance of oil paint, which was quite expensive and technologically specific. And suddenly this plastic-based medium enabled colour to be applied by an artist in certain ways, but also the industrial and post-industrial world suddenly found that colour was in everything, in the plastics we eat with, in the plastics that enable our cars to be so light, and our planes to fly, in our computer technology. It wouldn't exist without the developments of plastic. And once again, the colour we see on a computer screen is all because of the way colour can flow through and exist in a plastic pixel-based environment. In the science and physics of colour and the way it changes over time from classical physics in ancient Greece through to modern physics and contemporary physics. And the one thing you notice is that the idea of what colour and light is changes radically. And Umberto Eco, a really interesting commentator on culture, has said that in science, colour is one of the most muddled and confusing topics, because scientists are always changing their idea as to how colour and light works. And I think one of the most interesting writers on colour is an English artist, David Batchelor, and he wrote an amazing book in the year 2000 called Chromophobia, in which he managed to extricate himself entirely from the story of the science of colour, which is, I think, is a really difficult thing for artists to do, because if you're a painter, you get trained in the science of light and the colour wheel. And in many ways that can tie you down to a certain way of seeing light and colour and seeing how painting should be done. And he spoke about colour in the way we live it, in terms of almost an anthropology of colour, the way we experience it in movies, the way it's written about in books, the way certain kinds of artists use colour. And his book was a way to talk about colour in a really interesting way. And one of the ideas he had in the book was to divide the world between chromophobes and chromophiles. Chromophobes are very suspicious of colour and think that by using a limited colour range in your clothes, in your cars, in the colour of your buildings and in your paintings, you demonstrate your sophistication and your intelligence. And they're very suspicious of people who use lots of bright colour. They see them as either children or insane or something like that. Whereas chromophiles love colour and think colour is one of the important parts of the zest of life. And it involves using many colours, bright colours, and the strong physical, visual, almost bodily impact that colour can have. There are a few things to the aspect of colour. Some of them are quite esoteric and some of them are instantaneous. I'm reminded of what happened to op art in the 1960s, where a lot of people didn't take it seriously because it was so sensuous and immediate. And op art was seen as the opposite of conceptual art in the 1960s, which was very thoughtful and intellectual. But I think when you look back on it now, op art is very interesting in the fact that it was an art form that was so strongly visual and almost bypassed intellectual discussion. And the same thing could be said about colour. A rich, diverse and array of colours can have the same immediate sensual effect. And I think that's one of the important aspects of art, that it works in some cases instantaneously and immediately. Some artworks work over long periods of looking, thinking and finally coming to an understanding. I like an artwork that has a bit of both. I first started slumping perspex in my barbecue in the backyard of my house where my studio is. And I was doing smaller works, kind of small pet-sized works. And as you do after a while, you think, well, I'd like to do bigger works. And I couldn't imagine how to do that. So I'm lucky I work in a design school, UTS, and there are people who just about make anything there. So I did a bit of investigation and found out that you could actually get industrial-sized ovens in certain places around Sydney. Those places do huge perspex signs, they shape things in shaped perspex and acrylic in certain ways. So I found a place that does that kind of shaping, and they have ovens that are big enough to take a full sheet of perspex. That's 2.4 by 1.2 metres. So I shaped these works, the one that I'm sitting on and the other works in the show, by putting a full piece of perspex into the oven. And over about 20 minutes it heats up to where it's floppy like fabric. If you go too far it begins to bubble and smoke and it's ruined. But at that particular midway point, when it comes out of the oven, it's just a floppy piece of fabric, and you have about 2 or 3 minutes to shape it before it goes back to rock solid. And I made a first series of works, and the first ones just collapsed onto the ground like a pool of coloured liquid, and I realised I needed to be able to hold them up. They needed to stay up, and then be able to whip an object out while they were hardening so that it stayed in a certain shape. And the first object I used to do that was a chair. So I slumped the perspex around a chair, and then after a minute when it was cooling, still soft but not hard, I was able to move the chair out and shape it into the shape that I wanted. And after a while doing that, I thought, well, I quite like the chair shape. When the chair's in there, I'd like to make a chair and table as well. So they resulted in the chair and table works that are in the show. So when I started to think about other possibilities for painting and the way painting could be, and I started to pull painting apart, I began to think about, well, what is the history of painting? Where does painting come from? So I thought a lot about, did a lot of research into what is painting, what are its origins, and I felt like I could get a bit of an overview on it and see this trajectory going from the cave to the church to canvas, and where might it go beyond that? It seems that our earliest understanding of when human beings began to become a little bit more sophisticated, the first thing they did was to crawl into long, dark caves and make markings on the wall that looked like animals and weird shapings. And from there was a natural progression in almost the spiritual, religious aspect of what went on in those caves to the church wall. The wall was still the surface on which those marks had to be made. And the most radical invention of the modern world was the portability of painting, where paint didn't need to rely on an immovable structure like a cave or a church, but could go onto a stretched canvas or a hard surface that could be carried from one country or one church to another. And I think, over those great periods of time, we find ourselves in a new period of time where we begin to ask another question. Well, what's the step from cave to church to canvas? What's the step beyond that? And I think the one-word answer to that is expanded painting. Expanded painting is the step beyond having to rely on a flat surface, the traditional surface of painting. The journey from cave to church to canvas is almost like an evolutionary process, similar to a fish growing legs and stepping out of the water, or an ape standing erect. So the same journey happens for painting, in that it migrates from the wall to the floor, and in that shift it moves from 2D to 3D, from a static moment to occupying all time and space. And in that move, painting is empowered then to incorporate within its folds all the other media, all the other disciplines: sculpture, installation, performance, video, text, and so on.